Thank you so much, Coach Jensen, for joining me. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to chat with me on stream. For those who don't know you, why don't you give us a little bit of a background, who you are, how you started, and what you've done in esports?
The last time I think people would have kind of heard of me is either when I was announced that I was helping out the GAM roster during the Worlds run last year. And that was something that I was helping out a friend of mine, Hanke, and I actually flew over to Vietnam and everything just to give some consulting advice on this is how you prepare for events. And I was translating the knowledge that I had gained over my years of coaching to help them prepare for that, right? And that was kind of a little bit of a rebuilding year for GAM. So if we want to, we can go a little bit more into that. And then I was surprised when they did list me as a part of the staff for the World's Run because they didn't fly me over and stuff like that, right? So it was one of those. Okay, I guess it's nice to get some recognition with that. But more recognizably, I suppose most of your audience here on Twitch is from North America. Is that I was working with in the collegiate scene with Maryville in 2022.
Mhm.
And then that was when I brought on Zyko and APA onto the Maryville team. And then before that, I was at Immortals. I was the coach of the academy team, working with Joey and Keith McBrief,
Hmm.
right?
I know Keith,
Vibrant
yeah.
Anda was the team for a while, yeah. And prior to that, I've been pretty much around the world, right? I've been to so that's just covering North America and Vietnam. Before that, 2020, I was in Australia with the OPL. And that was during the onset of the pandemic. 2019, I was working with Splice, doing two-way coaching between now that's the fancy term for it. It's called two-way coach, right? But back then I was doing positional coaching and then I was coaching on the academy team as well, which was the Splice Vipers. I was brought as in the middle of the season to fight some fires, and then I went on in the second half of the year doing positional coaching for Kobe and Tori, right? Now it's not back then it was known as Noscaret
Mhm.
for the Spice team. And then prior to that, it was 2018. So that would have been my 1 year in Evos in Vietnam, right? So this is it's quite a globe hopping journey. And then 2017 was my debut year of professional coaching. I was just sharing with my friends. It's actually such a shame that because Garena gave up the IP to League of Legends back to
Mm.
Riot, they deleted all the VODs. Right, so you
Oh,
cannot find anything of that LMS, that year of LMS, but there's like still those highlight channels that I was finding the
wow.
time that my top laner was so busy trash talking, he forgot to lock in the champion. So this is my debut stage game, right, as a coach. It's my first ever time going on stage as a coach, right? We're playing against HKA, right? I think it's now it's safe to say we're basically a sister team we're basically a sister team at the point of time, right? We're basically living in HK's basement, right? It's the same gaming house. It's like this three-story mansion, and then Fireball was the sister team. Our sister teams were not allowed at the point of time, so we were kind of just living in the basement and then we were beating them in all the in houses. So we went on stage, and I think it probably leaked out somewhere that we were beating them these in houses and stuff like that. So some people was like, okay, maybe Fireball can win this. So it was best of three series because LMS plays best of threes, and the score was 1-1. We were going to the third game. My top laner is just so busy trash talking. He wasn't even the actual top laner. He was a stand-in top laner, right? Because my actual top laner was suspended for toxicity in solo queue, which is the thing and was the thing that happens back in the
Uh,
day, right? So he was so busy trash talking the opponent top laner because they fumbled some dive the previous game and stuff like that. But didn't pick Elise, he didn't pick Elise, the timer ran out, and then they random Heimerdinger.
oh
And
man.
then now they have to play Heimerdinger top lane. So that does kind of like
Actually, that could work nowadays, though. I've seen it. um,
yeah. But if you've never practiced it before, you don't know what's happening,
yeah,
and you
yeah,
just random it. And he
yeah.
just got absolutely crapped on. He's still a Baron, right? Like a friend of mine shared with
Okay.
me a clip from 2017. It's like the Heimerdinger steals the Baron. It's like, okay, wow.
He made something out of it.
He made something out of it, but they still lost the game. It was
Sure.
freaking doom.
Yeah, old school
um,
esports, man. It's like the back in the day when the Wild Wild West, like everyone could just kind of get away with a lot of stuff that you can't really do as much now. What do you think has changed in your mind over the course of those years? You know, from all these different regions, going across, you know, different solo queues, different, just watching pro evolve. Like, what's the biggest change in your mind?
Wow, that's all I can go with. I can go with the meta, the theory of the game. Not sure if that's something that would exactly resonate
Um,
with the audience here, considering that this is generally
yeah, you can keep it,
on
keep
the
it,
more
yeah,
broad topic, philosophical kind of things.
yeah.
So I don't want to go into like nitty-gritty of like, hey, this is how Rift Herald changed from this season, where
No, no,
if
no,
you guys
no.
remember, there was like one
I
point of
mean,
time you kill it, it
yeah,
just gave you a buff, right?
yeah, yeah.
It just gave you a buff, and if you died, you lost the buff. That was
No,
it.
I'm talking more about like what have you seen change in organizations?
Okay, right. I'll share a little bit from the coaching perspective, and this is a little bit of a story that I tend to share, right? Because this is something that now that I go back and I've explored, dipping my feet in some other games as well, talking to people from even say the Dota scene and from other games as well. The way that organizations and structures approach in League of Legends is far accelerated. I'm not doing this necessarily. The league is better than whatsoever. So I would say that this is a consequence of Riot's very heavy-handed approach, or not heavy-handed, but rather very top-down approach of saying that this is esports, this is our direction for it, this is our vision for it. You guys play these long ass seasons, and you guys have roster locks, and you guys are committed to playing for these longer periods of time. So it built up and it enabled organizations to have a lot of consistency,
Hmm.
and it enabled this type of longer. I'm not going to say long-term planning because in the context of what we have in the esports as compared to regular sports, is still extremely short-term, right? Where if you go back to the early days of, let's say, season three, season four, where coaching wasn't really a thing, and then the coach is basically a six pair of eyes to help the players spot out mistakes as a friend of the team, and I know that up until very recently, coaches in games like Dota, you think like Dota with their long history, they would have much more advanced coaching practices or much more similar to coaching practices as well. But if but it was only until the 2020s when OG won the titles back to back, then you actually started to have people who really valued coaching. And this was a result of the autonomous structure where basically players would just keep shuffling until they could try in the hopes of trying to find the best team. Because only one tournament really mattered in the circuit, right? Which was the TI, which paid out like $40 million or something at a point of time.
Hmm.
So the incentive structure was not conducive to having long-term planning or having a coach that say that, okay, this is how we're going to periodize for a long period of time, because it rewarded players being able to shuffle and find the best five for whatever the particular matter was at a point of time, or whoever they felt had the best synergy.
Hmm.
So that was what League of Legends used to be in season three, right? Whereas basically you had these people coming in, they were other players, they couldn't get a spot on another team, and then not to say that all coaches were were like that, right? But that was the natural progression of how people would get into this position. And this is a time as well where I would still say is the transition away from the mouse pad era of esports, where you weren't really playing for prize money. People who got into esports back then, it's not because they were looking at this and saying that, oh, this is a lucrative career. I'm gonna be paid millions of dollars. This is literally I'm good at games. Yeah. Oh wow, I can get a free holiday, right? To go somewhere. And there was like
Yeah.
one step beyond that, which is that okay, there's a significant amount of prize money that we could be playing for right now, and maybe just maybe this might become a career, right? So you have all these ex pros from this period of time. They will still come up and say today that they never really thought that esports as a career could be a thing, and that was the nature of what it was. And all of a sudden, Riot came in. They established the LCS. They established coaches being needing to be part of the LCS, and
Hmm.
they established this seasonal thing as compared to the circuits that people used to play, where you'd be a lot more similar to that of a semi-pro tennis player, but you couldn't really do that as a full-time thing, and you had to do like coaching or whatsoever as your main income source, and then you would then have to go out and then play these events, and then you have to fly and figure out your budgeting and your health and your travel. On your own regard, right?
Hmm.
And that was what used to be the ESL circuit in season two. So once they established all these style of things, coaching, of course, it became a little bit less of a managerial thing, or you could say it's a bit more of a managerial thing, depending on what angle you're looking at the point of time. And now the coaches could say that, okay, I'm just going to be here as a six pair of eyes to help players out. And then people over time they realize that we have these long seasons, and then maybe the coaches, when Riot allowed the coach to go on the stage to draft, the natural implication was that okay, the coach is in charge of drafting. Right. And then there's at least I would say that that's the most rudimentary level of strategic coordination that the coach was then assigned with doing, right? Because
Yeah.
there's no official job scope as to what a coach is, other than
Right.
if
Well,
the
I
if
I
the
mean,
team loses, you get paid, right?
different teams have different ways of doing it, right? So there's teams that have
Hmm.
the full strategic staff. There's the teams that have just one head coach doing everything. There's teams, so it's kind of, in my opinion, always been sort of dependent on the resources available for the team, and what's kind of worked in the past, right? So I guess from your perspective, then, what is your philosophy towards how coaching staff should be assembled? Like in an ideal world, how would you assemble a coaching staff?
Well, I think I wrote about this in 2019 a little bit. It really depends on the goals of the organization, how big the team is, and what the overall approach to things are going to be like, right? So okay, let me speed up the spiel a little bit, right? So a little bit less of the storytelling. And your coaching basically evolved from season 3 to season 5, where they realized that coaching required a certain level of strategic coordination, and then they realized that coaching required some amount of leadership, so you needed to handle personalities. And then we started to move into the era of super teams, right? Season 5, season 6, and then it was a lot about your ability to then play defense for players, which as we know, some players, some coaches like Yamato Cannon or Peter Dunn are very, very good at playing defense for their players. When a team loses, they go out there, they handle the PR, they handle the things that the players don't want to do. Or in the sporting world, we call that professional scapegoating, right? And then people started to rise. Wait, okay, actually, when these coaches do a decent job in the leadership areas and the strategic coordination areas, let's try to give them a 1 year overview as to what it's like to carry out a project from start to finish throughout the entire year, right? So it's actually very disappointing when I see teams they let go of coaches far too early.
Yeah.
Um, but the idea is that when you give a coach an entire year, then they are able to say, okay, this is how we're going to periodize, and this is how we're going to plan for the spring split, MSI, the summer split, and then if roles is on the cards for the teams, this is how
Right.
we're going to plan the run up for roles and all those things as well.
Yeah.
But even in the 1 year scope, a lot of times these coaches they don't necessarily have full say over the roster. And then this is where we start to enter what I call the modern era of League of Legends, where these days the head coach, your job scope is not just to handle 1 year project. You're talking about a 3 year projection, or maybe a 2 year projection, right? I would say the most relevant and most successful model, I would say, I call the Peter Dunn model. In the first year, you focus very heavily on culture. You do not get the op to spend much, and then you focus on okay, and then you figure out what the limitations of the team are. And then in the second year, you bring in the necessary pieces that you think can integrate into your culture and are able to fill those holes that you're looking for. And then in the second year, that's when you make your heavy push to then complement the key pieces that you're building around in the first year as well.
So
Right. It's a
yeah,
much more budget
you're
friendly
describing
approach.
essentially a traditional pro sports model. You
But it's very accelerated. It's very accelerated in the
I
span
mean,
of 2 years, right?
sort of, because I don't think most esports teams are even looking year to year. They're looking split to split, right?
Hmm.
And that I agree. I think that's a huge disservice to both players, coaches, staff, like fans even. I mean, ironically, fans are usually the reason why they end up pushing these changes too quickly, but it's sort of unfair to fans to give players and coaches basically 3 months, 4 months to figure it out. And if they can't, it's scrapped. They scrap the whole project. It's a waste of money. No, like I totally agree. I mean, you can't even think about playing for championships on a year-to-year basis, right? You look at any other sport, football, soccer, basketball, any of that. When teams build for a championship run, it's a 3 to 4 year process. They're looking at assembling enough picks. They're looking at assembling enough talent, staff, building the culture, like I said, building the environment, and preparing for that run. It's not, oh, hey, we got a super team. We're gonna gel overnight, and then we're gonna beat all these other teams in the league. It doesn't make sense, right? And I think the superstar era, especially, I'm gonna talk mainly about LCS, right? Because that's probably the most relevant to my audience. But when you look at the LCS, the way they constructed teams that win domestic championships, it's been on superstar power. Very rarely, I think the only team that genuinely developed a culture and won the split based off of the organizational performance side in the last few splits. I mean, there's been two actually now. NRG and EG are the two that stand out the most to me. And I'm a little biased because I worked on that EG roster, but that EG roster was not projected to be top four, right? We had Danny and Jojo Pune, who were both rookies. They brought in Inspired, who everyone knew was good, but then also, nobody thought that team was going to be a superstar team that was going to win a championship and actually go to MSI. But organizationally, it was what we talked about. What we focused on the first half of the split, and obviously, it's not even following your model of 3 years. We expedited everything, but the first few months was heavily focused on culture. We had them doing things like going to the beach, hanging out together, working on conflict resolution. And that was a lot of work from the mental performance specialist. But superstar power, we've seen the teams like TL, Cloud9, right? Like they've won a lot of splits domestically because they have just outstanding players across the board, and they can't compete internationally. And so to me, what's always stood out is, when you look at other regions now, right? So what stands out to me is LCK, LPL. uh, organizationally, they seem to do a much better job of getting teams to buy into a culture, right? Do you have experience with that, or what do you think about the difference between those regions in terms of culture?
So I think that this is one of culture is a very big topic that I think that opened that was my eyes were open up to in America, because a lot of things I took for granted was something that I really needed to work on a lot more actively, because I would just straight up own it. Like in on the models, I felt that I wasn't as successful because I didn't understand the nuances of what it takes for a coach to be successful at enforcing culture and implementing culture. Right. I think that for people who are familiar with me, who have watched my content in general, they would know that I have a very that I'm decent-ish, right? I'll rather say I'm fairly confident in claiming that I'm decent-ish at teaching these strategic elements of the game, right? And to talk a little bit about my coaching philosophy, I would say that this is 25% in four domains. There's like the in-game strategic element, there is the performance element,
Mm-hmm.
there is the team culture element, which is the relationships element, and then there's the systems element,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the systems and knowledge elements, that's where I would say is a A plus grade that I bring to the table, and my ability to teach and to structure the game, give game knowledge from my context, from my understanding of the game, and structure it into ways that and break it down for people, right? As people can see from the board review worksheets that I do, from the YouTube content I put out there as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the relationships domain where I think that it really tripped me up because of these cultural differences between what happens in the West and the East. And this is something that if you guys look on my YouTube channel, I actually had talked about this, right? Where I'm from Singapore. So when the pandemic broke out in 2020, there was one split that I coached back in the PCS, right? Which is in the Southeast Asian slash Taiwanese circuit. And over there, I coached this team called Resurgence, which was a team of Singaporeans. And there was two players from Hong Kong as well at some point on the team. And it was about the big reflection was me failing to understand that this was a team that was not primed, was not set up for success culturally, and then trying to jump into the strategic elements of things and them not understanding of the right conflict resolution processes just made things extremely inefficient in the ways that I tried to do things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, even though I knew that there was a weakness of mine coming to NA, I didn't have the necessary know-how to understand what culture is. So, what is exactly culture setting from a coach's perspective? It's there's a lot of theories you can read about out there about steel, about empathy, about the powers of coaching and stuff like lots of theory, right? But I worked with Robert Yip. He's
Mm-hmm.
the director of performance art models, and he put it in a very simple manner. Culture is two sentences. We do we do things like this here, or we do not do things like this here. It was not about theory, it was not about structure, it was about the daily enforcement and integrity of holding up to the values that you set out for the team.
Mm-hmm.
The simple ability to go in there and say that, hey guys, this is how we do things. Hey guys, this is not how we do things. Whenever you see things that you want to correct accordingly, and your ability to step in and then immediately address things on the spot. That is culture, right? Sometimes it is not say a very verbal thing, but it's a much more a lead by example kind of thing when it comes to say even like really simple things like pushing chairs in of the scripts and stuff like that. What does it mean? Do we want to construct our identities as people who are more towards like the bad boys of esports or whatsoever? And then you have a team culture that's a kind of like rah like a frat house and stuff like that. There's no right, there's no wrong. But this is what entails culture setting. And if you're a coach there listening to this thinking about okay, um, how do I enforce a culture within the team? It's not about PowerPoint presentations, although that helps in terms of getting people onto the same page. It's about what you do on a day-to-day basis. Two sentences. We do things like this here. We do not do things like this here.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, and then what did you notice as a difference though, going from pro to, academy to collegiate? Obviously there's
Right.
major cultural shifts that have to occur there from pro to collegiate, but
Okay. So to run people through kind of the decisions, right, that I was making is that when I came to NA, I was put into academy position. And I think when we talk about priming people for cultural success.
Mhm.
In the East, there's rather collectivist culture, especially in the Confucian cultures, right? So conflict resolution is expected to be handled, and people are okay with external arbitration. So when the coach comes in and there's a form of external arbitration, there's a form of authority that's generally respected, right? Even if teams with a much weaker coaching structure, things like player skill, player seniority, or age seniority, there is a much more established hierarchy, and that lends a certain degree of implicit power in the way that people are able to then enforce that hierarchy or authority, be it as player coaches or whatsoever. Right,
Mhm.
so like player coaches is a thing that you hear about quite a fair bit in the East, right? When you hear about players like Karsa, like Doinby, or like Sword at one point of time as well,
Mhm.
or like what's his name, Mako, right? Where they have these very influential voices on the teams, and I think Faker these days is a very prime example of that as well
Mhm.
on T1, where you have these very influential legacy names that the real value is their leadership ability and the fact that people will immediately defer to the authority, right? And there's very little need for cultural integration towards that because that's what people have been primed to do in school. Your seniors say something, you listen to your seniors. When you go out with your seniors, you pour drinks for them and stuff like that, right? It's baked into the culture itself.
Mhm.
In Europe, you have a very strong sense of sporting culture, right? So while you aren't necessarily primed in a particular way to handling relationships with other teammates and stuff like that,
Mhm.
you would at least have a base of experiences to draw from, right?
Mhm.
The guys from Norway, they played like soccer for their village or whatsoever. And then I think there's like the guys from wherever they played handball, they were swimmers. They have all interacted in team environments. They were at some point come across conflict.
Mhm.
And their solution to conflict was to, and because of the way that sports are set up in Europe, they are forced to deal with the conflict, right? You come from, you guys are all from the same area, from the same locale, and that kid who's maybe not so good with his ball handling skills and stuff like that, you're gonna have need to have a conversation with him
Mhm.
or to find a way to work around those restraints because
Yeah.
you guys are in the same age group and you guys will keep playing on the same team together for your same locale, right? So if you don't do something about it, then you guys will continue to suck. And so there's all these push factors that really encourages them to get better at this form of addressing problems, solving problems, conflict resolution, and there's also a much more direct culture over there in Europe where people are not are less afraid to call things out and then let things get very heated and escalating things. In fact, I would say that that's one of the things that I did deal with in Europe, where they would escalate things too fast, and then they didn't necessarily know how to to de-escalate it other than the immediate social bonding outside of the game, right? So the escalation was good because it meant that they were surfacing problems. It's just that their problem solving routines probably needed a little bit of shifting, and then you could implement things like creating domain languages so to make sure that everybody understands that when we say that okay, what it means to be strong side, this is what it actually means, right? Or everybody's saying tempo, but actually nobody understands what the word really means. So we have to get rid of that from the language, and then we need to recreate certain terms and phrases to make sure that everybody's functioning on the same page, right? So that is where my ability to come in with systems and knowledge was quite useful with regards to that. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. I'm
No, no,
getting
no.
sidetracked
Sorry.
again here. But the whole point
Yeah.
is about
So then,
cultural
so
priming
college
for
though,
conflict resolution.
college
Yes.
though, in relation to pro is different. I mean, because you talked about like traditional sports experience, right? Any
Mhm.
kid who's played sports on a sports team understands coaching, coaching authority, and understands conflict resolution between teammates. Are you saying that like North American teams, especially in collegiate, just didn't have that experience, and that was why you had an issue with maybe how they handled conflict, or?
Well, it's a little bit different here. So I've got a prime it here in the I know I'm doing this whole soapbox thing and just telling stories and stuff like that, but I feel like the context is important here,
Mhm.
right? That when I worked on the models, that the thing was that there was no underlying cultural setup here. It was similar to what I experienced in Singapore, where there's no cultural advantages in terms of how players handle conflict, how players navigate team environments. And the reality is that the tier two scene in America is not exactly a developmental thing, right?
Well, yeah.
You play solo queue, you hit high ranked enough, you attend scouting grounds or whatsoever, or somebody hypes you up as the next whatever. There's the next mid laner, the next top laner, the next jungler, and then all of a sudden they fly you out, and now you're in LA, which, as I discovered later on, is very different from the rest of America.
Hmm.
And then you are playing in a full-time environment with other teammates, right? And your only prior experiences that is playing online. You get to play the occasional LAN and stuff like that. And this is also compared to the Eastern teams, where if you hit 1,000 points, you do a 1 month long boot camp. They fly you out to Shanghai. You do a 1 month long boot camp over there. Then you learn how to figure out, okay, this is what it means to be coached. This is what it means to interact with teammates.
Hmm.
And then you're put in the academy position, and then you're given these metrics. They hit this matrix. Okay, we don't think you hit this metrics, and then we move on to somebody else. So there's no real space for development, right? And I would say that another criticism of the academy system is that it's effectively a bench for American players. Sorry, not for American players, for the LCS teams they hatch against their superstars, right?
Yeah. So, well, so I would
So,
say that, I mean, there's definitely differences, and we're talking about tier two back when Academy existed, which it doesn't
yes.
anymore. But I mean,
Mhm.
certain teams definitely use their Academy teams in different ways, right? Like I think there's a huge disparity between the way that TL, C9, arguably EG, FlyQuest, the way they use their Academy teams versus how Immortals, Dignitas, some of the other teams use their Academy teams. I actually did talk to some players who were on other academy teams, and they described the situation of, hey, I don't feel like I'm improving. I'm just playing scrims and then I'm playing on stage and that's it. There's no feedback on how I should be developing as a player. And one of these players I've mentioned before, he's actually a starting jungler now in LCS, and he said that academy sort of held him back because he was in a system where he was expected to do these things, but there was no actual system in place to make him improve or to develop as a player. Whereas I have a lot of firsthand experience with the way that C9 Academy was run or EG Academy was run. And that was very, very focused on player development. It was very much like, hey, we want you to do these certain things. We want you to scrim the LCS team. We want you to, like get coached by the coaches who are also working with LCS. And they would do a lot of, interaction between the LCS player and the Academy player, which is something I think, it's just it's a missed opportunity for a lot of teams when they have these resources. And unfortunately, they don't even have them anymore. But when they had them and they just didn't use them to their full capacity, it's like you kind of kill tier two. And then long term, killing tier two kills tier one, right? Like that's why we see these recycled players over and over now. Or we did. I think this is the split where I've seen the most interesting roster moves. I think in LCS in the last probably 5 to 7 years. Um, but we're also, interestingly enough, this is also the split where I've seen the most parity. Like, is that a coincidence? It's kind of cool to see. Like players are arguably, or teams are arguably playing better this split as a whole. I don't know if the ceiling is as high as it's been in the past, but it's nice to see some competitiveness in the league. Um, and then in collegiate, then I mean, you coached obviously at arguably the most
Maryville,
successful,
yeah.
yeah, the most successful collegiate team ever. What was that experience like in terms of going from pro to suddenly, you're in the top of the pack team? Like you guys can essentially at every role say you have one of the best players in each role in the entire league, right? Like what was that experience like compared to pro?
So I went to the collegiate because I wanted to really put a lot of the theories that I've had developed to the test, right? Not just in terms of in-game things, but in terms of out of game things.
Mm-hmm.
I still strongly believe in having a multi-man rotational system, and that's probably one of the more controversial things that I have.
You're talking about
Right.
a multi-man roster where you're subbing players in.
Yeah, having a 10-man roster,
Okay.
because that's what people have in the East, and it allows for the redundancy, right? So to go back to how people use tier two, or how people use redundancy in the East, is that we hear about these insane work ethic and training schedules, right? And then people always go, oh, but what about burnout? Oh, what if the player is tired? What if the player is not feeling well and stuff like that, right? I know, especially if you have done any form of sports before, what the dangers of having an opt-in system is, but the reality is that a lot, okay, I cannot say for sure, right? Because there are going to be coaches out there who actually force the players to do those 16-hour schedules, right?
Yeah.
But they set it up so that people can run at the pace of your Don Bs, of your capses, of your anomalies, right? Of the people who want to be playing those schedules, so
Mm-hmm.
that there is enough people who are able to for them to run at the pace.
Right.
Right. So if people want to do a night block, and then they'll say that there's two people who cannot run at the pace, then it's like, okay, 16 hours a day is too much for me. There are people who are willing to sub and play accordingly. When I went to trial for one of the LPL teams, this is in end of 2019, I went over there, it was a scrim, and then the top laner said that I'm not playing with this mid and jungler anymore. And he's quite a superstar, right? So he just said, screw this, I'm not gonna play anymore. And he went to queue up for a game of TFT in after game one of a scrim set, not after the scrim set. So this is game one. The mid and jungle they grief the game and he says, "Sorry, screw you guys. I'm not scrimming with these guys." And he goes and plays TFT. If this was an NA team, right, or if this was any Western team, not just to specify NA. This would be a very, very big problem, right? Because
Right.
this means that the
Right.
scrim block has to be cancelled, and then you need to have these like meetings after meetings after meetings to kind of figure out, okay, how do we handle this?
Right.
Over there, they just brushed it off, and then they call up this guy, right? It's complete random. You would never have heard of this guy. And then he just sits in there and he fills in for scrims, right? He doesn't exactly execute the lane to power and things like that. But it enables the other four players in the team to continue, have a scrim experience, right? And then well, the top laner who subbed in this case was not completely terrible, right? But he definitely was not on the superstar level. It's not going to be
Right.
a point of where you can reliably play through, but it enables the rest of the team to say, okay, this is how we're going to fix our mid and jungle problems. This is how we can work on coordinating the rest of the map, and they can cover whatever topics they wanted to cover in scrims
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the path time is like figuring out what was this new Affiliates champion, giving them a read on like what the Misfortune Affiliates matchup was going to be like, and all that kind of jazz, right? So that was what I feel that was correct.
Yeah, I think
So
that's actually a really good idea because I've seen a lot of scrims at the LCS level where one or more players will get super tilted, right? Like one or two games in. And although in LCS there's sort of this professionalism, like, okay, nobody that I know was gonna drop a scrim game to go play TFT. Like that's just like you're about to get fired if you do that, right? So they wouldn't do that, but they would definitely sort of have a wasted practice the rest of the day, right? Because they're just going to kind of run it down a bit. You know, there's certain players with a reputation for doing that. It'd be nice if you're like, hey, you know what? Go take a walk, sit out for a game. We're going to sub someone in. You can cool off, and maybe you just need that mental break. But it also gives the other player, right, the player that's subbing in, a chance to show off what they got, and then that creates a little bit of competitiveness too. Like, what if the substitute mid laner comes and just pops off? Now, is if they do that consecutively and you're having issues, right? Are you about to lose your spot? And then that kind of helps some players like refocus a little bit. Like, okay, maybe I need to calm down. I need to stop tilting, and I actually need to keep my spot here. I've always thought competition is good. I agree. I think when you're in fear of your spot being taken, and I've talked to a lot of pros about this, and there's mixed opinions about it. Most pros don't like it because they think that if you fear that your spot is going to be taken potentially, you're going to play way too safe and you're not gonna int, you're not gonna try anything. And I'm like, okay, that's a very game specific thing, but at the same time, if you're playing safe all the time, that also shows as being not a strong player. You're not gonna win your lane. You're not gonna help your team. Like if you're a coach watching that, it's not about your KDA. You're just being useless, you know. So I've always thought overall competition is a good thing, regardless of how it makes the player feel.
you see, the thing here is that in the West, this is framed as competition, right? Because there's this individualistic framing of things, right? I'm competing with this guy, I'm giving this mid laner the chance to shine, I'm giving the top laner the chance to shine. A lot of times in the East, right? If you watch like the behind the scenes of the LPL documentaries, when you see like these random subbing in because this top laner is having a rough time. I think it was like with LG one year, Ali. So okay, just to be clear, the player I was talking about is not Ali, right? It was not Ali who went to play TFT, right?
We're
But
not
it's
flaming
like
Allah here.
him and then yes, right. And then it's like I think it was like the episodes where Doinb was actually going in there because Ali was having a very rough split, right? He
Right.
was having confidence issues and stuff like that. So he decided to take a break and stuff like that. And then
Mm-hmm.
the other top laner came in. And then the way that they would do things is that they would continue to support each other. They don't see this as competition necessarily. They see it as more of collaboration. And of course, this does not apply to all players in the East. There are players who also go in there with an individualistic and competitive mindset, right? But the support that you have between players, right? Or even if you see the times where Liu Mao, right, or LV Mao,
Mm-hmm.
And when you see him in the behind the scenes things, this guy is a guy who actively wants to play support, but he always gets benched. And then you see him in the behind the scenes, and he's there, he's coaching the team, he's giving them feedback, he's very engaged in helping the rest of his teammates succeed.
Hmm.
Right. And of course, sometimes it might be because some of these players have pedigree, they have star play, that they're star
Hmm.
power, and they know that at the end of the day, the Orcs, when push comes to shove in the playoffs, they will be playing at the end of the day because they know that this is why the Orc is paying them this amount of money. Right. But of course, they need to be able to execute on that level. Right. But when if it means like setting up for one game, setting up for 1 week, they don't have an issue doing that because they see as a collaborative kind of thing. It's like, okay, I'm not in a good space mentally right now.
Yeah.
It's an opt-in system, right? It's an opt-in system.
Well,
So
I've even heard of like the collaborative idea of like, okay, are you going to train your replacement? Players are really against that too. Like they're
mhm.
so worried that if they help the academy top laner get better at laning, that they're actually helping their competition. They're going to lose their role, and it's like to me that's just so paradoxical. When you are a high level athlete in anything, you should always welcome the challenge of, yeah, you're training this person to get better, but that is also going to help you improve as well, right? Like your iron sharpens iron. You need to sharpen yourself in laning against them, and if they improve, you need to get better. And if you truly deserve your spot, you should never really get to a point where you train them to be better than you, right? It should continually push both players to improve. And you don't see that in any other traditional sport, right? Like Kobe would always say, I don't care if I teach you how to be better at basketball. I'm still going to be better than you. And if you get better at this moment, then great, you're going to push me and I'm going to improve even more. So it's sort of a unique thing I've seen in esports, specifically League of Legends, where there's this mentality that uh, helping someone else will hurt you, especially in the pro scene.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to fault the players for doing that because
No.
I can understand where the motivation comes from, right? And this is why I said that I wanted to move into collegiate because I felt that culturally, attitudes to these sort of things, like this is if this is what they have truly believed, right? And this is the system that players have worked with. When they were an academy player,
Mm-hmm.
their seniors refused to scrim them. The LCS players refused to scrim them because this was the mentality over there. When they become the LCS players, it is going to be very difficult to convince them otherwise, right?
Right.
Some people have the charisma, they have what we call the mouth, right? If Better Call Saul, right, or Saruman whatsoever, they can speak and they have the charm, and then people listen.
Mm-hmm.
Most coaches are not that. I am not that. Right. I do not have the mouth. I'm decent at presenting arguments. I'm decent at persuading people. But to persuade people against their lived experiences for the last 2 years, for the last 3 years. And I guess this is where the whole veteran versus rookie debate comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is the rookies are a little bit of a fresh slate. You don't have to deal with this baggage. You don't have to deal with the bit of experiences and bad habits and bad experiences that they might have had. And it's easier to mold them accordingly. Right. But if you're dealing with players who have been in the system, it's harder to convince them that, okay, you got to go scrim these people now because this is what they've been told, this is what they've been believed that when they were academy players, they didn't get this type of help as well. So they'd be thinking, if I did it myself, why can't they do it themselves as well?
Sure.
And that's a lot harder to overcome. So I felt that this needed to be addressed on a cultural level, and this is why I decided to go into the collegiate space, where it would be easier to then, well, with more space, more time, and more ability to then really influence these type of things with me,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Well, and then so you mentioned the reason that you wanted to go to collegiate was for these reasons. Is that what you experienced?
Yes, I would say for a very large part of it, right? For the part where things went well for me in Maryville, I think things were going very well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things that I wanted to implement, the diamond rotating system, the overall reduced amount of contact hours with the game, right? Where this is one of those questions where I think it's not talked about enough. This like fixation on amount of hours played, amount of scrim games played, amount of solo queue games played. Sometimes you have to wonder, right? How much are players actually getting out of this?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I always do as a coach is that I would do daily journals, right? Where I would just write down that this is what the team covered on this day, this were the key learning points, and then I'll get the players to do daily journals as well. And that is a struggle in general, right? Players freaking hate journaling or keeping track of paperwork. But um, what I actually found is that no matter how much we script, right, and this is even in my time in Vietnam and stuff like that, there will only be like about 3 things a player learns in a day. And that doesn't really increase or decrease. Like if you have like script blocks canceled on you, you will still find things that you just have like three key takeaways. And sometimes these key takeaways will be repeated as well. So in the learning and developmental phase, it's not really about quantity of games that you're playing. It's about the quality of those games and how much are you able to recur those learning points so that you drill these things in the protocols for the team. So it wasn't about getting in it's not about the 5 hour, it's not about a 5 game scrim block or the 2 times 3 or the 3 times 3 or how much you're scrimming. It's about
Hmm.
how much value are you getting out of those hours and are your players engaged with the game,
Yeah.
right? And
Well,
why is it that I still look at solo queue metrics? Is that if a player is playing a
exactly.
lot of
Yeah.
solo queue,
I was about to
mhm,
say solo queue is the best example of that, right? Every coach I've ever talked to about coaching players to improve is like, don't spam solo queue games. You do one and then you VOD review, you make it an actual effective learning session, and then you play another one. You don't, just you playing 10 games a day is actually not going to help you very much.
it does. Okay, sorry. It it does help you because it gives you the repetition, it gives you the volume in,
Right. Well, I
right?
should say
But
mindlessly
the way I
playing,
say it,
mindlessly playing 10.
yeah,
Yeah.
the way I say it is that we have to remember, right? People always draw the analogy that solo queue is like going to the gym.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And if you have a very high rating in solo queue, it means that your PR at the gym is very high,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what is at the gym? But what is in solo queue that's not in the gym is this flashing lights that says victory or defeat accordingly. Is the dopamine hit that you get from playing solo queue. And one of the things that are not spoken about is that how much of it is that are you engaged with the game, and how much of this is because you're addicted.
Mm-hmm.
So I still look at solo queue stats, even though I would say that solo queue and the actual in-game experience is very different.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of a measure of how engaged are my players, right? If my players playing lots of solo queue, it's usually a good sign because it shows that they're engaged. But I need to make sure that these numbers are high because they are engaged and not because they're addicted to the Skinner box that can be the LP gain and loss system,
Yeah.
right? Like I think everybody here who has played Syracuse has experienced that before. It's 12 midnight, right? You had an absolute barn burner of 40-minute game and you lose that game.
Yeah.
You know you
Yeah.
have something to do at 6 a.m. the next day, and you tell yourself, there's no way I end on a loss here, right? Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
engagement? Is that addiction? It's a very fine line between the two,
Well, I
right?
mean, yeah.
If you are enjoying yourself, that's engagement. But if there is a negative emotional response, where at the end of the next game and you go to bed angry and you're not dreaming about League of Legends, this is one of the other questions I also ask players very often, right? When was the last time you dreamed about League of Legends? And players who are engaged with the game, they say, just yesterday night, I was solo killing away. I dreamt up of this new champion that Riot made, and I got a pentakill with him,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or it could be nightmares as well, right? Even if it's nightmares, if
Yeah.
these things are appearing in your minds while you sleep, it is a sign that you're engaged with the game. It's a positive thing,
Hmm.
right? But if they are doing all these things, but then their mind is not focused on the game, they're not eating, sleeping, and breathing League of Legends. It's not appearing in their dreams. They're addicted, right? And then this is where you need some form of intervention with them to help them rewire their processes, right? Like, okay, what's happening over here
Mm-hmm.
is very clear that you're not enjoying yourself when you play solo queue. And it's very clear because you will see that these players, their mood would generally be very bad. They show up to practice, they would generally respond very negatively whenever things go wrong and things like that. Of course, when things go wrong, people tend to express things negatively. But if you've coached before, if you've worked in a team environment before, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's the very it's the very quick to FF, very quick to it's Doom. I miss 2CS, right? That kind of thing. And then you can tell that there is something wrong that's happening over here. And sometimes that's happening as well because they're just not engaged with the game, right? So some people they so that there's two factors here. Engagement is engagement, and then are they enjoying themselves when they're playing the game or not? And then you
Mm-hmm.
can look at solo queue values to kind of tell this style of things, right? So yeah,
Yeah, that
you
makes
got
sense.
any thoughts on that?
I've definitely been through that a few times over the last few years. I definitely had nightmares. I actually tweeted about it. I have nightmares about solo queue sometimes of like, oh my gosh, my loss streak was continuing, so I woke up and had to play a game. But but I usually won. Like I think that's it's really difficult. The interesting thing about esports and league and especially professional gaming is that there's so much comparison between our own experience as players at the casual and amateur level to what pros experience in terms of like there's similarities between everyone's solo queue experience, right? When I talk to challenger players, I talk to these, forever pro, challenger players, their in-game experience is very comparable to what I experienced in bronze and silver back in the day. Like you get instinct teammates, you get toxic players, and at the end of the day, all you can rely on is yourself. And you have to just do your best to climb. And that doesn't change no matter the rank. It just gets harder and harder to do that because then the effects of what you do are magnified more, and the effects of what your teammates do is magnified more because you can abuse things more easily. But it's really interesting that the mental side of it, how you work on self improvement, how you work on team dynamics, all that doesn't really ever change. It's sort of a universal human experience in a game like this. Um, I guess my question would be then, so in collegiate then, obviously they are one, not professional, so they don't have the same mindset of like this is my job. This is something that they're choosing to do, and it's sort of a job because they're oftentimes signed, especially at Maryville, right? They're scholarship players. It's part of their livelihood essentially because they're getting college tuition to do it. But then they
Okay,
also yeah,
you finish first, yeah.
they also have to juggle the rigors of academics. They also have to juggle social life, right? You're in college. There's a strong influence of a lot of external distraction and factors that come into play. Um, how hard is it then to keep the culture on track and focusing on what you need them to focus on, which is how do we get better at the game?
I think at Maryville I was a lot better to handle culture and to influence culture. Firstly is the way that things were set up. This is not me coming in as like, oh, this random guy from Singapore, from Southeast Asia coming over. I'm gonna need him to prove himself, his worth to me, right?
Mhm.
It helped that there were some players there who were previously in the OPL, and I think that I have a decent rep from my time when I was in the OPL.
Mhm.
So there was really quite a positive reception. It was what I could bring to the table. And this is where I have what I call this concept of coaching capital, right? If you're Coma and you go to any team in the world
Yeah.
and then you say jump, right? Because you have so much coaching capital,
Yeah.
everybody's going to ask you how high, right? Even the people who weren't in the room,
Right.
from the room next door, they come and ask you, wait, you said jump? How high?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because you have a lot of coaching capital. But if you're a relative nobody, or if you're, say, somebody who is very out of the depth, and then you need to go handle an LCS team, the amount of coaching capital that you start with is less, right? Of course,
Right.
people's skills, your ability to communicate, your ability to persuade people would then stretch your dollar further. But the reality of it is that the rep that you have in relation to the space that you're working in gives you a certain amount of coaching capital,
Sure.
right? And there's things you can do to increase that coaching capital by developing a strong rapport with people. And then whenever conflict happens or things that leaves gives people bad experiences, that decreases your coaching capital as well. So naturally, moving over from pro to collegiate, I had quite a decent amount of coaching capital with them. So that gave me a lot of space to then say that this is how I want to do things. This is how I see things being done. And I was able to work on those things. I started them out with an orientation package, get them to do a very sort of autoethnography, which is write about their life, write about how they saw themselves, right? And then this is because this is a collegiate space and this is not a programming space. There are already writing essays is normal for them. So I had these very beautifully written essays about their times when they struggled on this program, where they were brought on the scholarship. They felt that, wow, I've been brought on here. I've not played a single game in my entire time as a student athlete under the
Mhm.
program, right? And they just felt so bad about it and and how that has impacted their identities and how they want that identity to change. I brought up the book of Atomic Habits about how we influence change by shaping the identities that we have around that.
Mhm.
And then we then develop on, okay, these are the four keywords, right, that we are going to focus around. This is how we're going to shape our culture moving forward. So I think this is about 2 years ago, but I think it's like some of it was like um deliberateness. I don't recall what the other things were, right? But deliberateness was
Sure.
one of those that sticks in the back of my mind because it's about the idea that how we going to get more out of less, right? Because we're only going to be scrimming 3 hours a day. You guys are students first, and I always wanted to make that clear to them. You guys are students first, so make sure that your academics are right. If you do not pass your classes, you cannot play,
Mhm.
right? Be it by the rules of the collegiate scene or we through our own self-enforcement, right? I know that some people that year they did not follow alongside those rules, but that's a I'm not going to go into that kind of stuff, right?
Sure.
We had the standards, and this goes back to privilege, I guess, right? You set the standard, you say that this is what we do here, right? If we want to emphasize that there are students and athletes in equal parts, then academics must be important as well.
Right.
I don't care if you're the top player, if you're
Right.
a two
It's
million
it's
point
it's a
challenger
minimum. Yeah,
player.
it's a minimum. You
Hmm.
have to maintain that. But then, like I guess it's different at Maryville, you're right, because you have a talent base that was already there. You had players that literally competed at an LCS level for a little bit, like it's a little bit tough. But how do you feel then about collegiate path to pro then? Is in NA specifically, right? And I'm not talking about the ideal setup, but in North America, what we see in traditional sports is that college is generally the path to pro because there's an access to facilities and experiences that directly translates to professional play that they may otherwise not have. And we're seeing that really, really come out right now, especially with the dissolution of tier two, as it were, right? The official tier two academy teams are gone. It's strictly NACL now. So we're seeing basically every team in NACL is operating with bare minimum resources. To me, that says there's a huge advantage now in going collegiate, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The more resources that you have in collegiate, right? The ability to get to get help from counseling, the ability to diversify yourself as somebody who let's be real here, tier two is very risky business, right?
No,
You're not tier one, you're dedicating a very large amount of time of your life to doing this that may or may not work out, right? You're not set for your life, you're not made for life. In fact, I would say even in tier one right now, it doesn't set you for
no,
life, now that the $1 million
not
salaries
even
are
close.
no longer around,
Yeah.
right? So it's something that you don't you it helps you hedge against that. If you're getting an education at the same time, it helps you develop social skills. It puts you into a position where I would have to say that these institutions, there is a what we call a transcendental. To use the big words here, is that there's transcendental elements of being in a collegiate space as compared to being in some random house in Beverly Hills,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
If you're on a college campus, there's an unspoken set of rules and an unspoken influence on you as a person or anybody who has been in a schooling environment, who has been in a schooling environment before, and that lends to your development and growth as a player. When you step on a campus, the expectation is that this is a space for growth. This is a space for development. When you step into a house in Beverly Hills, you're in a house in Beverly Hills,
Yeah.
there's no transcendental power that can elevate your experience in that space. So, rather than sounding like a mystic over there, I would also have to say that in the shared resources that you have between the sports faculties and esports, and I would just say the ability to hatch your future against having an education and doing all these style things as well. I
Hmm.
just think it's a much more stable way of doing things.
Hmm.
And why I say is like why I like to have collegiate spaces is that it's generally easier to have a larger roster of players. It doesn't cost them an astronomical amount, right? Which is one of the reasons why it was not possible to have the large tier two systems that they have in Korea and China, right? Where in Korea you have like these B houses, in China you have the academy team training system and stuff like that, where you have like these 20 people. Yeah, there's like 20 people who are there underneath your B team, right? So you're not just talking about the LDL team, there's talking about the LPL team, the LDL team, and then another 20 people who are just living in the building training together with the team.
Hmm.
You can't afford that in America on LA minimum wage.
Yeah.
But in collegiate, you don't need that many, right? But the fact that you have redundancy, because you need to have the redundancy in case people fail classes, in case people have major life events that they need to attend to, then that creates increased area of exposure for conflict resolution, for priming people towards teams
I think
things, right? And
even
I
just
think
the
the very
even just
strong,
land experience, right? You can't get that playing NACL.
yeah.
You basically play online, and that's a huge jump for people, right? To sit next to somebody and have to communicate in person. There's a huge difference there.
And the thing about collegiate I like is that there is this like going back to what we talked about coming from the same locale in Europe, right? Is that you're kind of forced to play with the same people for a set amount, right? You
Yeah.
don't fire players, you don't change players. You can get more players on scholarships and stuff like that. You can have a certain amount of redundancy. But
Mhm.
the fact is that whoever's in that room with you is you're gonna be in the room with them for some time.
Yeah.
So you gotta learn how to make good with them. You gotta learn how to overcome that. And I would have to say also that we talked about transcendental influences is that the collegiate path to pro being very prevalent in sports makes it a lot easier to prime this as a means of development for players in esports as well,
Mhm.
right? Because it gives them more recognition from family, from friends, and when we talked about the relationships domain, your extra team dynamics. Who is your network of support outside of esports, right?
Yeah.
And that's a very important element that I think that people don't consider enough. And then having these people be primed to say that this is something that's a lot more acceptable to them, all of a sudden these players are getting much more support from people that are not in Discord groups, right? From people who they go up with on Thanksgiving, and then they say, "Oh, I see that you're doing this program here." Of course, recognition is not necessarily guaranteed, but it's a lot easier for somebody who's not familiar with esports to accept that they are getting a scholarship, getting an education, and then it's a lot easier for them to get support from people who can then see the value in what they're doing.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. No, no, that's a huge, huge thing. I definitely think there's so much opportunity in the space, and hopefully, there's always an upside to everything, right? So the downside of tier two sort of dissolving this last year is obviously that there's a lot less stability in the space. It's a lot less viable for pros to pursue pro now. But on the upside, it's sort of shifted attention and it shifted resources a bit, and you're seeing a lot more high level players go into collegiate, right? Like Dardoch and some of these other players who left LCS level to go basically to college, which is great for them. They get a college scholarship out of it. They can work on their own outside of game future. But it's also raised the overall level of collegiate. And that's always been the biggest criticism of CLOL is that there's just not enough good players to make it a path to pro. I've talked to a lot of LCS players about it. Like, hey, how do you think collegiate would eventually do? And the complaint was always they're not good enough. But if we start seeing a saturation of LCS caliber players going down there and sort of elevating the overall competition, hopefully that means that collegiate could be comparable to NACL. And actually, it's great seeing this split. This split NACL. Maryville is tied for first, right? They're doing really really well. There's some SLU is playing under an amateur org team name, but they're doing very well. So that's what I want to see. I want to see more parity even at the tier two, tier three level. And I think that collegiate, once you start getting enough talent down there, is kind of the best way to go because you're going to have access to resources. You're going to have the external factors of playing with people in person, playing at lands, being in an actual coached environment, which I think a lot of NACL teams don't have. Like they'll scrim online and then they have a coach who will sort of give them feedback and that's it. In a collegiate team, there's organization, there's structure, there's a lot of that preparing you for a professional lifestyle that I think a lot of rookies at even the tier one level don't really understand until they get there. It's not easy for a kid who just left home and probably had everything taken care of for them by their parents, and had food made and all stuff, and then all of a sudden they're shipped to LA, thrown onto a team, have to live by themselves and figure things out with a team manager, but then they're also expected to do content, to act as a professional, not tweet stupid stuff, like know how to talk in front of a camera. Like all these things are just suddenly thrown at you. Um, I think college could be a really good place to develop some of that prior.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely agree with that. Like it's just about like what's the interfacing between amateur and pro. And I think the collegiate is it's a great way to buffer that, right? You go in there, you have it hedges your bets, it gives you a breadth of experiences, it gives you a social life, which I think it's a shame that when I see that players are in a collegiate space and they don't really make friends with anybody on campus outside of the players that they're immediately with, right? And of course, I always very strongly encourage that if you're on a collegiate team, go out there, get contacts, right? At least
Yeah.
maybe that's me projecting from my university, from my own college experience when I was a university kid. It's not so much about what classes you go for and things like that, right? It's about the contacts that you make along the way and the experiences that those contacts open you up to.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, okay. Yeah. So we hit about an hour, but so I don't want to take up too much of your time. Is there anything that you kind of want to go over in terms of, what you would like to see out of coaches going forward? Whether, your own philosophy or just what you see in other coaching staffs, what you've seen in the league as a whole that you think could be improved?
Wow, that's so much I can talk about. But let's just say Wow, where do I begin with this? It's a not to say
Well,
that I think that there's a lot that's
I
wrong. I
guess
think that there's some things that
let's
people
focus
are starting to correct and do
specifically,
correctly.
yeah, specifically on LCS. Like, what is the one thing that stands out to you about coaching in general that probably could um, get improved on, or something that you notice is glaring issue in our region?
Okay, let's since we talked a lot about cultural differences, I think that when you're a coach in this style of space, it's very important to understand integration dynamics, right? Between people from different cultures, people from different points in their careers, what it's like to have the perspective of a veteran, what it's like to have the perspective of a rookie, how those two people are going to interact, and likewise, what is it like to be a veteran from? So you got to draw the matrix, right? So local veteran, local rookie, rookie import, rookie veteran. Sorry, not rookie veteran. Import veteran, right?
Mhm.
Under this matrix, they will all have very, very different expectations, and they have very different ideas and ways that they expect to interact with their teammates.
Mhm.
Being able to interface that, I think, is the most important thing, right? And then being able to take all this influx, possible influx that Collegiate might be able to have, and figuring out to say that, okay, what is the advantage of NA? Spending power, the ability to import, right? With the ability to import. And then now, as we develop this tier two scene, is this going to be the Peter Dunn model where we do 1 year focus on culture, and then we talk about importing the right pieces to bolster that, right? And then are we importing rookies? Are we importing veterans accordingly? What is likely to be a culture fit, right? The tempting thing to say is to import veterans straight off the bat because that's going to give you a more complete package.
Mhm.
Cultural integration is a very important factor here that has to be considered as well. Why do super teams fail? Why do some of these big name organizations they get this like superstar rosters and why does it not work out? I would have to say that there can be lots of reasons why, but I think it can boil down to these factors as to this matrix of different archetypes and how they interact were not sufficient to create a to create a cohesive functional team environment.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for taking time to chat. I really appreciate you. Hopefully, when you get back to California, we can hang out again, grab some food, play some Warhammer, and yeah, hopefully, we see you soon back in esports again. I've always been a big fan of systems-based coaching, and I think when we chatted previously, a few different times, I like that what you're espousing, what you advocate for, is very much in line with what I think is lacking in the professional esports right now. Is there's not a lot of coaches who are looking at systems of development, looking at long-term planning. It's always like, how do we win now? And I think winning is a process. It's not a result. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
hopefully we definitely see more of that thought process going forward too from coaches everywhere. But yeah, thank you so much, and I will upload the video to YouTube, and I'll talk to you again soon, hopefully.
All right, cheers. Thanks for having me.
All right, have a good night. Bye.
See ya.